Hey everybody, it's Tom Davis. I am here with an old friend of mine, Mr. Thomas Peele. He is a Pulitzer-Prize-winning investigative reporter. He and I worked at in Delaware 30 years ago, but he's gone on to some really great things. And he is our special guest for this session. Just some things about Tom. Tom's been a reporter in California for over 20 years. He was the lead reporter on the Chauncey Bailey project, which was a collaborative, essentially, project that followed the assassination of the Oakland Post editor Chauncey Bailey by members of a Black Muslim cult in 2007. He now works for a journalism nonprofit called EdSource, and he also teaches at University of California, Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you for having me, Tom. Hi, everybody.
Now Tom actually has got his start working for the Ocean County Observer. He worked for other newspapers too, but the Ocean County Observer was a newspaper in the 1980s and 1990s where both of us worked. He and I both covered a lot of meetings, which is your assignment, your major assignment, your final assignment for this semester. Now Tom considers himself an investigative reporter, and he is, and he's also, and that's why he won the Pulitzer. But I mean, a lot of that instinct, a lot of that starts with the very basic fundamentals of journalism, and that is doing things like covering a meeting. I mean, covering a meeting can almost be like an investigative project of itself, especially the way they're set up. They're not set up to be public friendly. They're not set up to be something that, you know, is like a chat room or something on the internet where you can easily have like give and take. It's very formal. It can be very bland, but it's the reporter's job is to basically bring whatever is going on at that meeting home to the reader. And it's often difficult to do that. It's often, you know, when you're sitting there in a meeting or you're watching now, a lot of them are on Zoom, a lot of them are actually being videotaped, and you got to find that one thing that maybe kind of sticks out among the rest, or maybe is maybe the most important or most valuable, most newsworthy thing for the reader to have. So Tom, I'd like to ask you about just that, how to cover meetings, how you went about that, how you were successful in doing that, because I know you covered some big ones. Why do you think it's so essential to be covering these meetings in the first place?
Well, you know, when I was a young reporter at the Ocean County Observer in 1988, you know, a big chunk of the paper's news coverage came out of covering township and borough governing board meetings, school board meetings, planning and zoning board meetings, water board meetings, because it was Ocean County and there were a lot of problems with providing enough drinking water for people. And they really, you know, they filled up the paper on a daily basis. And it was, people were more civically engaged 30 some odd years ago than they are now. And there was always interest in what a local governing body was doing, and they have a lot of influence and control over what happens in a community. So, you know, my very first day at the Reporter, I was at the Observer, excuse me, I was, you know, sent out to a borough council meeting in Beechwood, and I didn't know my rear end from a hole in the ground, really. And I was told to come back with a story. And I got there and I found the agenda for the meeting and listed everything under the New Jersey Open Public Meetings Act that the Borough Council could talk about. And it was like, I wonder if anything on this piece of paper is newsworthy. And there was one thing. They own the borough government owned a local marina where people in Beechwood on the Toms River, if they had a boat, that's where they kept it. And they had an ordinance where they were going to increase for the coming boating season all the fees. And that seemed like a story. So they voted to introduce this ordinance. An ordinance is a local law, and under New Jersey rules, they have to vote to introduce it, and then they have to wait 2 weeks and have a public hearing and then vote to make it final. And this was the introduction. So they introduced this ordinance. And then I waited through the meeting with deadline approaching, and they adjourned, and I ran up and I asked the member of the Borough Council who would introduce the ordinance a couple of basic questions. And I went back to the newspaper and I wrote 8 or 10 inches on it, pulling information off the agenda about how much the fees were going up, put in a quote from the person who introduced it and a quote from the mayor, and turned the story into the desk. And that was that. And that became sort of what my early reporting days were like. This was a paper where you went to work at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you worked till 11 or midnight. And guaranteed on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights, you were going to some kind of meeting. And eventually, 3 towns in Ocean County were assigned to me to cover. So then I was looking at going to meetings in those particular places, especially the planning and zoning board meetings, because there was a lot of growth going on. And there was a lot of opposition to growth, a lot of development in the Pinelands. Some of these places I had were within the Pineland zone. So after a while, there becomes a rhythm to it, and you know what's going on, and okay, this ordinance that was introduced 2 weeks ago will be made final next week. So next week, I've got to make sure I'm at this meeting to report on whether they made it final or not, and what people had to say about it. Under law, meetings have to be noticed, which means if you guys are going to a meeting, you're going to get the agenda for the meeting before, at least, I don't know exactly what New Jersey law is now. I haven't worked in the state in a long time, but you'll get the agenda for the meeting 4 or 5 days prior, so you have time to make a plan.
What is the agenda? What exactly is on it?
Everything that they have to vote on. They can't just decide random. A public body can't just decide randomly, hey, let's decide to borrow $1 million to pave the street the mayor lives on because it's got a pothole. Right? They have to give the public notice about what they're going to do and when they're going to do it. It's supposed to be no surprises. Now there are ways around it. When I was there in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't a perfect law. For instance, bodies could vote to amend the agenda and bring something forward with no notice. I think that's since been banned. But essentially,
they still can, by the way. They still can.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's in California where I am now. You can't do that. And the notice requirements are longer. There are 10 days out here, so you really have an idea about when a governing body is going to do something. But you have a plan, right? That they're scheduled to vote on something. If it's going to go late, you can, or something that's up on deadline, you write the background copy first, so that's done, and then you do what's called putting a fresh top on it, by writing the direct news about what happened. The city council voted 4-3 Tuesday to name Tom Davis Rutgers Educator of the Year, or something like that. Something that would never happen. But you see my point. So you can plan these things. Now, where there are 2 things then that happen that are good for young reporters to do these things. One, you kind of figure out how stuff works. And a big part of being an effective municipal government reporter is really understanding process. So when the process gets a little haywire, you can report that it's a little haywire. But if you don't understand the process of how government works, you can't really report on government. So you have to think of a meeting as an opportunity at learning by osmosis to
Mhm.
kind of soak in how these things go. You go to
Like a
planning board
sponge.
meetings,
Yeah.
some developers coming in and saying they're going to build 500 homes, and they've got to lay everything out about what their plans are to get those plans approved by a public body. And you learn how that process works. So when you may find a time that it's being skimped on or there's subterfuge in that process, you can recognize it and write a better story. Um, the other thing is that public meetings, people come and bitch and gripe, and this is when a member of the public can talk to all the elected officials at once, because they have to sit there and they have to give them their 2 minutes or whatever the limit is for how long somebody could come in and talk about whatever's going on in the town that they want to bring to the local government. And that's where you find the people who are gadflies, the people who are interested, the people who might like to talk to a reporter and tell them what's going on. And eventually you get into a cycle of doing this, and you get sort of into all of the issues that are going on. And then you can start reporting on issues before they reach the governing body.
Exactly.
People will go in and they'll complain that all the storm drains on their street back up every time it rains. And all of a sudden, now the governing body's got to pass an ordinance or a resolution to have the Public Works Department take on a big project to fix that. You can kind of be reporting on the genesis of these things, which makes the news more interesting and makes you as a reporter look very aware and proactive and kind of wired into what the issues are.
One of my favorite stories is to be a mayor, and I know you know who this is, Tom, in Berkeley Township,
Mhm.
New Jersey, by the name of Bill Zimmerman, who used to give reporters a stethoscope and to listen in on secret conversations. So, but he was the kind of guy you'd pull aside, even
Mhm.
though it was a bit crazy, but he's a guy you were talking about. You'd pull aside and maybe try to get the story before it's actually talked about, before it's actually introduced.
Right. You find out what's really going on. And, trick that I always had was meetings would sometimes go late in the night, and sometimes you'd have to, um, you'd write some advance copy, um, and then you'd stay and you'd phone it in. And we actually back in the day had to use payphones. If you don't know what a payphone is, ask Professor Davis; he'll tell you. Um, I'm kidding.
You
I'm
used
sure
to
you
have it at Rutgers. Yeah.
all know what payphones are. So, eventually you get 2 hours into a meeting and they got to take a break because people have to go to the bathroom or go outside and have a cigarette. Um, so I'd always have like a pack of cigarettes with me, even though I didn't really smoke. And when people would go outside, the mayor would go outside to have, a couple of stress relieving cigarettes at a hot meeting or something. I'd always go out and fake smoke, because that's when you can just kind of get in a conversation with somebody, right? And ask what's going on. And then it seems a little bit more natural than just hounding somebody and following them outside. So I considered cigarettes to be a business expense just for that, because when you get good at this, the meeting kind of becomes your focal point, but then you find that you branch off and all these other issues that are talked about are being decided. The other thing that happens at meetings is people will give reports. You'll sit there and you'll go through at the start of the meeting, the finance officer will give a report on the town's finances. The police chief might give a report, all the department heads, and you're constantly picking up on that stuff and thinking, hey, the police chief talked about some new program. That might be a story I could do tomorrow. Or the planning director said, we're anticipating, some major applications and we're going to have to beef up our inspection staff. That could be a story, things like that. So there's just, you're kind of at the hub of what's, you know, going on. So it's not just the story that you're there to do. It's the story you might do tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, and what those stories lead to.
I was just gonna say that they're not just a place to get like a breaking news story. They're obviously, it's even more important actually to go to these meetings just to get information,
Mhm.
information on anything, anything that's talked about and through the various means that you just described. And I mean, you did touch on this a bit, but what are maybe some of the things they should do actually when when they walk into a meeting, or in some cases, I guess now they turn on the video. And what are some of the things that
Mhm.
maybe they should be looking for in general?
Well, I mean, I
Obviously,
hope,
big expenses, things like that. But
right. I hope these are meetings that people can actually physically go to. Um, because
right,
it's much easier to squeeze a question into somebody during a break that you might need um, in person than it is to try to do that at a Zoom meeting. Um, okay. I mean, some of this will sound a little simplistic, but it's things you need to do. You need to sit close enough that you can also physically see what's going on, like first or second row. Because
that's
if you're
right.
sitting in the back and a couple of people get in a dialogue, you may not know who, be able to tell immediately who is talking on the dais if you're too far back. If it's a place that you haven't been before, I mean, first off, the thing you want to do is always have the agenda, because the agenda is like going to a play and all the acts are laid out in the order in which they're going to occur. It's an the agenda is your organizer in a sense. And sometimes, they're doing a bunch of BS and they're doing proclamations about, um, making daffodil the official city flower or something, and you kind of can zone out a little bit for,
And that's something that
you
often
know,
happens at these meetings is that they often start
yeah,
off with those kinds of things. Like they bring in the Boy Scouts and they honor them. They bring in like, I don't know, the honor guard, the color guard, whatever. And they spend like their first 10 minutes or so doing that. Then they get to the real business.
yes. So you can kind of pick your moments when there's non-newsworthy things going on and you can zone out a little bit. Um, Look, again, you're going to have the agenda. The agenda is going to have people's names on it. If you can't get the agenda and you haven't been there before, you better make sure you write down and properly spell everybody's name off their name plaques. Um, the other thing that makes sitting up front good is during the public comment, people will come up and say um, their name and get their 2 or 3 minutes to talk. But oftentimes they're not asked to spell their name. So, you
Right.
know, unless you already know them and are extremely confident that you can get their name right, if they're a new person for you, even if their name is Smith, you don't know if it's spelled with an I or a Y. So you've got to be able to get them. And it's easier to get them if you're right up front when they turn away and say, "Hey, I'm from the paper, and I'm likely to quote what you just said about the mayor being a dickhead, and
Hmm.
please spell your name for me." Because you're sunk using that person's quote if you don't know their name. So you have to get that. But it's important to have a good vantage point.
Right. Um, how aggressive should they really be at the meeting? I mean, if somebody like says something and walks away, or we talked about pulling people aside. I mean,
Mhm.
should never be necessarily shy to do that, right? Especially if,
Right. If
um,
you have got to get what you need to get your story filed. And if that means bugging somebody to get their name, you've got to bug them to get your name if that what that person said is important to your story, because chances are at a public meeting there isn't an editor around that's going to let you quote
right,
somebody without identifying who they are. So you've got to get that, and you've got to do whatever you have to do to get that. If that means, following them outside or whatever. And let's say they tell you you're an enemy of the people and they're not going to give you the name, and then you're like stuck. But one, your rear end is covered because you tell your editor you had the effort, and then the editor is going to ask you, well, did you ask the clerk how they recorded it for the minutes of the meeting, and you better say yes. So you better go back in and find a way to um, ask the clerk how they recorded who that person was, or how they spelled their name, or whether they've been there before. Now also, maybe because you'll have a phone with you, which we certainly didn't have as reporters in the 80s. Um, maybe you can find some stuff out by Googling them, and you could even match a photograph of that person to the person that you just saw and know what their name is. But if you can't do that, you might have to pass a note to the city clerk, who is the person in charge of making sure the agenda is followed and taking minutes for the meeting, and ask them, hey, uh, how did you record the spelling of that person's name? Because you absolutely have to get that and get that right.
That's actually a really good point. And actually, it's also a good place to go is to Google and get background information if they bring up certain issues. You bring your laptop or whatever, and you
Right,
basically can actually right
right.
there find a library of things that might relate to it. And obviously,
Mhm.
you have to be careful about using that information. You make sure that you attribute it to the source, obviously, if it's on the internet. So
Right. But like I said, when Professor Davis and I were doing this as young reporters, we really didn't have that technology. So there was a lot more thinking on one's feet to be able to leave there however much time you have on deadline to get a story written, knowing that you're complete. You don't have any holes. And that meant pestering people more than you might have to now when you have the technology. But you shouldn't just um, assume that you're going to get back to the office or back to your desk, wherever that may be, and find that you are going to be able to get what you need on the internet.
right.
Don't leave the meeting with a hole in your story.
What were some of the maybe a couple of the big stories you've covered? I remember you covered the township of Manchester had all sorts of wild things happen in the 80s. It's a town in southern New Jersey that had some real big scandals that happened.
Yeah, they had about 14 or 15 people who went to jail. They essentially had a cabal running the town that stole um, the township treasury. Most of the major officials in town, led by the township administrator, Mr. Portash, were in on it. They essentially were writing checks to themselves. They kept 2 sets of books. Um, that was huge. And something that went on and on and on and on, and grew far more than meeting coverage into investigative reporting. But I got onto it because I went to all the meetings, and I started to get a real sense that something was very fishy in the way that this township
Right.
did its business. It was very recalcitrant. It was very um clubbish, and the township administrator was clearly um the ringleader and the boss of what's going on. So you know I mean, one of the things that you pick up and you learn by going to a lot of meetings as a young reporter is that it's how you work on your bullshit meter. Sometimes you can get a sense when people are disingenuous, or issues are being dodged, or things may be predisposed to being passed when people are supposed to keep open minds based on testimony that's given at planning or zoning board meetings. And you know a lot of this stuff, you get a sense, is when things start to feel like everything that's going on is a fait accompli. Then you have to ask whether or not it's an intellectually honest process that
Right.
you're observing. There's really not a huge difference between you know, local government coverage and covering a debate in Congress or a hearing in the US Senate, which I've done on multiple occasions. You know, you show up, pay attention, you spell everybody's name right, and you use your news sense to figure out what the top of your story is, and you go into it um, having done research on what's going on. You know, if it's a planning board meeting and it's going to run late and there's a controversial project that some people want and some people don't, and it's going to get voted on at 11 o'clock, right on deadline. You know, you're going to have written a big chunk of that story based off background. You're going to know who the players are. You're going to have researched it, so you can be nimble and you can take the 15 minutes that you might get to put a fresh top on the copy you've already prepared and
Right.
send your story off. And I mean,
Rewriting a story is a good idea. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, but the thing is too, and this also doesn't change in the fact that you may be writing solely for the internet. Because the better prepared you are, the quicker you'll be. The quicker you are, the better chances are that you'll have the first story on a subject posted. If you have the first story on a subject posted, then your search numbers are going to go up. You're going to get on top of the algorithm. So when people search for that particular issue, they're going to find your story, and your story is going to get more page views, and that matters now. So the principles are kind of the same. I would say that, you know, the internet has changed everything about journalism, and it's changed nothing about journalism, because you still have to have the fundamental skills to get the story and get the story correctly, whether it's, you know, going in a print edition of a legacy newspaper, or it's going to an editor who's going to give it a quick read and post it to a website and have it out 15 minutes after you filed the story.
Anything you would like to say, or to the journalists?
I'm
Many,
gonna
many of
say,
them are just starting out.
to those of you who are interested in a career in journalism, I'll say this: you're making the worst possible career choice you could make, except for every other career choice.
Ah, nice. Okay.
See, you could go
That's
to
the hell
work
off
as
my laugh.
you could go to work as a finance officer in a bank. Okay, how boring is that?
Right.
Pretty boring. You could become an actuary
You could
for an
become an
insurance.
accountant like my son.
You
Yeah.
could become, you know, an actuary for an insurance company, sitting around figuring out when people are going to die and how much their life insurance premium should be. I mean, and maybe that's what you want to do, you know, and that's fine. But if you kind of have the bug for being a reporter, it's a pretty cool thing. And it's
Right.
hard, and it's supposed to be hard. Doing this stuff is not supposed to be easy. If it's that easy, then you're missing something.
That's right.
So it can be a pain in the ass way, you know, to make a living. But at the end of the day, you know, it's fun and it's socially important. It's vital right now, especially with what's going on in the country. Have Professor Davis and I are filming this on election night.
That's right.
Um, and, you know, our country, part of what we see in our country right now is a tremendous amount of ignorance and people who are susceptible to um, the first thing that they want to hear, like an election was stolen, when there's no evidence that an election was stolen, but they believe it was stolen. I mean, we need good, strong, assertive, extremely bright young people in journalism. We need bright, young, technically savvy people in journalism. So if you feel like this is something that you want to do, if it excites you, if you think it's kind of cool, it is kind of cool. Every day is different. There's not a lot of monotony. There's not a lot of sameness to it. Things come quickly. Days change, stories break. I won the Pulitzer Prize in 2017 for something I wouldn't have dreamt of that I was doing at 7 o'clock the next morning when I wouldn't have dreamt of it when I went to bed the night before, which was a fire that killed 36 people.
How'd you hear about that, by the way?
Photographer texted me.
Wow.
And when I figured out what was going on, I didn't do what every other reporter was doing, which was running to the scene of the fire. I knew that there were reporters at the scene of the fire, and I'm an investigative reporter. And the best way I can describe what investigative reporting is like a bunch of 5-year-olds playing soccer. If you've ever seen 5-year-olds playing soccer, what do? They all chase the ball, right? They're all around where the ball is. The investigative reporter is the person that's not chasing that ball, doing what everybody else is. They're the person at the other end of the field that you think is just standing around, because they're not doing what the pack does. So while everybody else was at this fire, I raced to the office and started looking up the ownership of this building where these 36 people had died overnight in a fire at a place that was a zone for a commercial warehouse, but was actually, an off the books illegal dance club with no fire safety protection.
Right.
And while everybody else was out at the fire, and they should have been out at the fire. I'm not saying they shouldn't have been there, but it takes somebody to go start doing the deeper work. And I instinctively, without even talking to an editor, knew what they would want me to do, and it was to go start doing that deeper work. And that's what was recognized by the Pulitzer jurors in 2017 when we won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news. Was my work on immediately trying to figure out what the ownership of that building was and how an illegal nightclub could have existed where it did without having been, shut down by the city. But that also comes with a lot of trial and error and a lot of time as a young reporter sitting in government meetings in Ocean County and Atlantic County, New Jersey, figuring out how things worked. And I think, immediately checking to see if I hadn't gone as a young reporter to countless zoning and planning board meetings, I wouldn't have known that the first thing I had to do about that fire was to check for what the building was zoned for, meaning this is what it was approved to be. This is what the government says that regulates buildings, says this building is a warehouse. That is an unambiguous word. It doesn't say it's a nightclub. It says it's a warehouse. A warehouse then cannot be a nightclub. So it immediately set me off on an avenue of reporting because that I knew was the first thing that I checked was what that property was zoned for. And the second that I saw that it wasn't zoned for something where there'd be a big dance party, then I knew I had a line of reporting that I had to follow out. And that line of reporting went on for 18 months. With many, many different angles to the stories that came out. A lot of it about fire safety and fire safety inspections and what people knew and when they knew it, and about what was going on at this building and why no one did anything about it. And it led to stories about a tragedy of errors and indifference by government that eventually led to 36 people being killed.
Right.
So it all kind of comes out of that fundamental stuff. Now, obviously, as we've talked about, things are different than when Professor Davis and I were young reporters. they're vastly different. I don't think we could have even conceptualized something like Twitter or what Twitter was up until, you know, last weekend when Musk closed his deal for it. And how fast information now is accessible to people. But you can also see how fast disinformation can be disseminated to the public. And we still need journalists to be the filter.
That's right.
And why it's more important than ever to have very clear thinking reporters with a pretty good bullshit meter for what's going on. Case in point, the attack out here, very close to where I am in the Bay Area, the attack on Mr. Pelosi about 10 days ago. And some of the reporting mistakes that were made. When I first heard or saw tweets that people on the right were saying that the man who attacked Mr. Pelosi with a hammer was actually his lover or a prostitute, I was like, oh, that's a typical thing that somebody in MAGA would say and not care if it was true. And I didn't even realize at first because it was so absurd that a local TV station out here in the Bay Area had reported that police told a reporter that when they showed up, the attacker was in his underwear. And that got out. And that's where that came from. Now, my immediate reaction to that is that's like a cop messing around with a reporter. Either a cop who absolutely knew how that would take off around the world on the internet, and that there's certain portion of the American populace would believe it without question, and that's what they wanted, or it was just a cop screwing around with a reporter. Either way, I think it was a horrendous reporting mistake. One of the things that the internet does, it makes us all more cutthroat to get something fast, but fast can lead to mistakes, like reporting the guy was in his underwear because he wasn't in his underwear.
Right.
And a pretty serious, mistake that even, Elon Musk retweeted, then was shamed into eventually deleting. But I'm not quite sure how a reporter would fall for that. It's almost, sometimes it's like, if something is too good to be true, it's probably not true. Like, chances are the guy's not gonna be in his underwear and is not a male prostitute. There's a very easy saying to remember, when in doubt, leave it out. And I'm sure that the TV reporter who got that information out and it was picked up by NBC News and they had to retract it, I don't know if that person got fired or what their situation is now, but it was a pretty bad mistake that the TV station had to publicly retract. So you've got to think. You've got to be thinking all the time and have a pretty good standard for yourself on what you're going to do to verify things and what level of trust you have for sources, because that was a horrible reporting mistake.
True.
So
I really appreciate it. This was all great, especially the lesson about the bullshit detector. And thank you. And
you're very welcome. And I'll tell you what, if you want to give your students my email address, if they have any questions, I'm sure, you're obviously capable of answering anything, but if there's anything I can do for them, If you email me and you say you're in Professor Davis's class, I'll get back to you. The other thing I just would say by way of advice is you've got to be constantly informing yourself. You've got to constantly be reading. If you want a reading list of books as a young reporter, I think you should be reading. Email me and say you're in Professor Davis's class, and I'll send you a reading list that I have given the many of my Berkeley students over the years.
Very nice. Maybe you could send your book.
I sneak it on the list.
Okay, there you go.
All right.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay. You're welcome. Have a good day, everybody.